this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Hi, welcome to the End Game. I'm Tom Shanahan, and I'm your host along with my co host, Herman Bulls. And we're very honored today to have the grandson of Gideon Smith, a pioneer at Michigan State, at Ferris State, and at his own, back home in his own stomping grounds of Hampton University, where he won a black national title. And John, John, you're the only grandchild, right, of
Yes,
Gideon? Yeah.
yes, yes.
So
Right. So I was like looking up, and in and having to reflect on that. Yes, yes, that's
yeah,
true.
so this is a real special opportunity to get a little more insight into Gideon's life.
Sure.
And then Herman Bowles, of course, is my co-host. Herman was the first black quarterback at his high school in Alabama in 1973.
Yes.
West Point graduate, retired West Point colonel, and successful businessman with JLL in Washington D.C. Herman, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, Tom and John. What a pleasure to meet you. And as we said before we went on the air, the descendant and the continuing royalty of college athletics, number one, and number two, something that we'll certainly get into. The importance of diversity and how that is so important not only to college athletics but to our nation. But it's a pleasure to be here with you, Tom, once again. And you know, uh, football season's upon us, so let's roll.
Yeah. Well, John just recently returned from Big Rapids, Michigan, my hometown, where Gideon Smith was enshrined in their Hall of Fame. He went there from the Hampton University as an exchange program that the president at Ferris and founder Woodbridge Ferris started with Hampton after he had read up from slavery with Booker T. Washington. He was motivated to do his role to help our country advance forward with the race issue. And about 12 black students came from Hampton. They were educated at Ferris, and the goal was for them to later transfer on to schools like Michigan State. As it happened, one of them was Gideon Smith, this great athlete. And he played at Ferris 1910 to 1912. And Ferris is proud to have him, even though it was just a fledgling school at the time. And John, tell us about that experience of being in Big Rapids, Michigan, and giving the Hall of Fame acceptance speech.
So it was very rewarding, and the actual event was something that I had been anticipating for a few years, and anticipating in the sense of the responsibility that I felt to articulate a message a bit differently from what I had been accustomed to, and had um, that reflected some questions that I had been wrestling with from some time, and that I expressed in a conversation that we had. And so, specifically, one of the questions that I had been contemplating was, as I thought about what I knew of my grandfather, um, his nature, um, his gentleness, what I thought of as his humanity, and as reflected in just his love for people, and his commitment, towards bringing out the best in people. And I juxtaposed that with the types of treatment that I knew that he experienced. You know, as so a combination of the stories that I had heard about, you know, what he encountered, as well as just knowing what the reality was of the times that he grew up.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
and
so,
not a lot was written about him in his lifetime, and so that's why we have to rely largely on what other people have said and what you, John, have learned from your own research, from his scrapbook and that type of thing.
yeah, so I want to also say about that. So he lived in his time, and so we know from the times what he was experiencing. And I, know so more of the specifics, hearing about in recent years, but how that fit in with the stories that I grew up with and what I experienced myself, the kinds of indignities that have been a part of this country's history that Black folks have had to go through, as a part of growing into the promise that's presented before us. And the question that I wrestled with and um, spoke with you about. So, as I had reflected more and more about the stories that I grew up with and processed my own experiences, and from what I got out of the stories that I heard from, my parents, and so what I got from that was like the trauma that was still there. And as I processed, I'm going to tell you, and it was a part of the fuel of my speech. It triggered so much rage as I thought about my grandfather's experiences, and the kind of person that I knew him to be. I cried before with you, Tom, when we spoke. Tears and rage. And so as I'm speaking now, I'm just letting, the emotional content be congruent with my words. So you can hear that,
Yeah,
in my speaking now.
yeah,
And so a question that I had was, so how did my grandfather maintain his humanity in the face of that? And then the question for me was, how do I maintain my humanity? But then it dawned on me, and it was a part of like that whole reflection period and anticipation period of, a message that I wanted to communicate on behalf of my grandfather. I recognized and realized that the rage is a part of our humanity. This is a human emotion. It's something that's natural in the face of certain kinds of treatment. And so it struck me that, um, my grandfather was limited in the ways that he could express his humanity. He had to have experienced the kind of rage. Um, and I don't want to highlight that too much, but because there's another part to the story, the rage
right.
is at the end of the story. But, I knew that that had to be something that he experienced, but because of the times, he had to channel it in a particular way, and it was channeled through um, his gentleness and his warmth and and the legacy that he built. So in any case, what I felt the responsibility to do when I spoke on behalf of my grandfather was just to name that and to note that and to um, just entertain the possibility that I was there to present a fuller picture of my grandfather's.
Yeah, yeah. Herman, your thoughts?
Well, as you very emotionally and effectively shared your feelings, I cannot help but appreciate the pride that you have for your grandfather.
Yes.
And, you know, I grew up in the South as well. And I've expressed many times, you know, seeing the KKK, going to the water fountains that are blacks only,
Right.
to the side door of the movie theater, going to the back
Absolutely.
of the restaurant to get your food.
Yes.
Those are indignities as I look back. However, like your grandfather, much, much more for your grandfather, having to live in that environment
Yes.
where you feel, well, part of it for me, I didn't know any other difference. So that was what you were supposed to do.
Yes.
Grandfather, I guess I'd say two things. Number one, in that time, to be an educated Black person,
Yes.
okay, that made him different. And you say the rage perhaps that he had, perhaps he was also a visionary, and he understood the fact that he was a trailblazer,
Absolutely.
not him who, and as a result of that, and I mean, even over George Floyd, John, I had a lot of rage myself. I mean, I was
Absolutely.
angry, I
Yes.
was mad,
Yes.
I had all of these things.
Yes.
However, at the same time, those were my personal feelings, and not that I did not articulate those, but I understood for the positions that I held, it
Right.
was important for me to look beyond the immediate rage and say, what is it that I can do to make it better? And I would have to speculate that perhaps your grandfather had some of those same feelings.
Yes. And so, in response to that, so for as for my personal experience and story, so that same idea, it's what you do with it. And so that has fueled, the path that I feel that I have been on and the work that I have done and continue to do. Um, so it's, for one thing, it's trying to have a hopeful vision, to draw upon, what I feel is an organizing principle of the universe, imagination, to imagine a future that we cannot see in our past. So to be a part of that. Um, and in terms of, the quote unquote, like the personal rage. So my intention in speaking on my grandfather's behalf was to transcend the personal rage part of it, because I was feeling a responsibility to speak on behalf of my grandfather, but also I have recognized so that there's generational rage, there's generational trauma. I've grown up with the stories and also have gone through the experiences. So, Maryland isn't quote unquote in the South, but I also grew up with places that I wasn't able to go to because I was Black. I was the first Black student as a first grader. And as the 5-year-old, having to process experiences that I didn't have the language for how I was, the treatment that I got. Um, but also, um, in growing up later, just thinking about, so at that time, as the first Black student, so it wasn't, and I went to school, McDonough School. So it wasn't that, okay, I went to the first grade. Okay, we've arrived.
But by the way, you're saying McDonough School. People need to know that that's a very, very exclusive school.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes.
So that our listeners understand that.
Sure, yes. So, so it was year by year. So the school became quote unquote integrated according to each grade that I entered. So it took 12 years for that process to happen. So, so my hope and my intention and my choice, because it was a deliberated decision that I came to, that it was time for me to just express more openly, because for the longest time, there were things that were happening internally, but for the sake of like feeling a responsibility in this or that situation, it was something that I chose not to express and to articulate. But as I saw more and more examples of other folks, too many folks making that same choice. Okay, this is what I'm feeling, but I'm not going to share it. I'm not going to show it. So I've just, for good, bad, or indifferent. So it's almost like an experiment for me to be intentional in, speaking um, more and more unfiltered, um, and recognizing that it's symptomatic of something that's beyond me. And if it's something that we as a society, as a world are going to transcend, we have to be able to um, um, excavate it, examine it, dismantle it,
Hmm.
transcend it. And a part of that process is what I heard you say, um, um, that we need to reflect something, another vision of possibilities in our actions. And so what has happened for me, and why I was saying rage isn't the end of the story. So the quote unquote end of the story for me is I recognize and realize that the most powerful force in the universe is love. And so those experiences is like, how does that get channeled into love? Love for people close to home, love for my grandchildren, love for my family, love for my friends, love for, my grandfather, my grandparents, my parents, those who have come before. And so what do I do with that love? What do I do with that responsibility?
Well, you do what your grandfather did, Gideon. Let's go back to how so he went to Ferris, and as I
Yes,
said, and then he goes to Michigan State from 1913 to 1915, and he
yes,
comes out for the football team, and so again, Ferris State and Michigan State, both places, he
yes,
was the first black football player,
yes,
and like I said, there aren't a lot of quotes from him. But when I did research for Ray of Light, which I wrote about Gideon in there and quoted
yes,
you in there, John.
yes, yes,
I did come across some Tristan DeBoer at Michigan State came across an old interview that he shared with me
yes,
with Blake Miller, who was one of Gideon's teammates and who had
yes,
made the All American teams back
yes.
then. And Blake Miller said this was in 1983. It
Hmm.
was taped. He said Gideon used to have a lot of abuse on the line, but
Yes.
he was a perfect gentleman, a wonderful fellow,
See?
very smart in college. So that's the
Yes,
gentleness you were talking about.
yes,
But also, as a football player, what a great football player he was. He probably should have been an All-American himself.
yes,
The
yes,
more
yes,
you learn about him,
yes,
but Miller said about his ability because remember, University of Michigan was a national power already established in those
yes,
days. Michigan
yes,
State was a fledgling school called Michigan Agricultural
right,
College,
yes,
and they had never beaten Michigan until the first two times with Gideon in 1913 and
right,
1915. And Gideon was a lineman, and here's what Blake Miller said: "Oh boy, there was a football player.
yes,
Gideon and they were both linemen. I don't think we had 3 yards against us the whole season.
yes,
I never saw a lineman that could stop a players the way he did. He'd
mhm,
just reach out with his arm like that, and boy, if he could get a hand on them, he'd bring them down.
right,
Oh, he was a terrific tackle.
yes,
No one could get by him."
yes,
What do you think
yes,
about that, Irvin?
Well, I think that he set the foundation for what you talk about always is the Underground Railroad going to Michigan State.
right,
And I'm John, I did Tom introduces me to so much history, and
yes, yes,
particularly Black history, that I'm a little, I guess I shouldn't be ashamed, because as we know, some of the things that are going on across the country now about what should be taught in school and how history should be taught. And learning these things is one of the reasons that I hang around Tom. But I'm just sitting here thinking, as you know, the first Black quarterback in Saturday Night Light Alabama playing football.
Yes,
I did have some Black teammates, but what that must have been like for your grandfather to go into such a ferocious sport where people could be dirty and do things and perhaps get away with it. It's hard for me to imagine how that would be.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And
so that's the heroism part, you know, and you alluded to that, or at least I took a reference to that in some of the, you know, the framing of this conversation. So that spirit is just something that's very powerful.
And as I quote Jimmy Ray, who came to Michigan State from segregated Fayetteville, North Carolina, the South's first Black quarterback to win a national title on the 65 and 66 teams. When he got there as a scared freshman in 1964, he was in Jennison Fieldhouse and he saw Gideon's portrait from 50 years earlier.
Right.
And he said, well, if Gideon can do it back then, I've got to try now.
Yeah.
And you, in addition to the Ferris State Hall of Fame that you recently attended, you were able to attend Gideon's induction posthumously again in 1992 in the Michigan State Hall of Fame, and your aunt attended with you. Tell us about that scene. What you remember from it?
So one of the things that I remember from it, so the quote that you read, so as I recall, that was something, that excerpt was from an interview, and the audio of that was played.
Right.
Was that the Hall of Fame induction. And I was, so that was the worst thing that could have happened. So, you know, the short video that they shared, and, you know, including those observations. And it's like, you know, seeing that, and it's like, okay, speak now. You know, filled with so much emotion. So I remember that. But of course, you know, I remember the pride of being there, accepting the honor on my grandfather's behalf, but also recognizing that it's a role that I played before. So the first time I accepted an honor on my grandfather's behalf was when I was 13 years old, you know, 13, 14, I think 13 years old. So it was something that I was used to, quote unquote, used to doing, you know, saw as a responsibility of mine and another opportunity to be there.
Let me ask you something, if I may. I've got three sons, I'm sorry, that have to somewhat follow in my shadow.
Yes.
So help me understand how they feel for the fact that you're going out there following in your granddad's shadow, doing all of this, in terms of what it is you need to do, what you should do, are there lonely moments? Feel sometimes, am I living up, et cetera, et cetera. Help me understand that.
So let me respond to that, and hopefully not coming across as, you know, being cute or glib, because I've never felt that I was following in my grandfather's shadow. If anything, you know, I felt that I've been following in his light. And so, you know, not just my grandfather, but, you know, my grandfathers, my grandparents, my parents, and you know, drawing inspiration and strength from them. So maybe more when it comes into play. So I don't have like an illustrious sports, you know, background of sports achievement. So measured against that, you know, if I had been in that realm, maybe it would have come into play. But even there, So I was a very good athlete. I used to be the fastest in my class. Um, I think of that phenomenon of black people, our capacity to be quarterbacks. I remember an incident.
Mhm.
Um, I took the quarterback position. This may have been middle school or something, and somebody said, "Belcher, you can't play quarterback." And so the play starts, and I run and then jump up in the air, and so it's like, excuse me, excusez-moi. So um, I played lacrosse. I saw one of your sons
Mhm.
play played lacrosse.
Mhm.
Wrestled. So I have a lot of that in my background. It got channeled into other paths, but again, maybe it probably would have been more of an issue if if my path had been to you know to stay involved with sports and to compete at some of those higher levels. Uh, and so maybe because of that, I'm able to say that I haven't felt in the shadow. I felt in the light. I've recognized um, different ways that I've been in that position of reflecting on what those before me and my family had gone through, and so how to draw strength from that and to bring it forward in the different areas in which I do work, have
So,
worked.
so speaking of reflections, and you obviously know Gideon Smith um, through osmosis more than Tom and me. What do you think he would say about the current state of America and integration and diversity? And that may not be a fair question, but
Right.
you
So
know
yeah,
the
so
history.
I would wonder myself, but then so that would mean that he would be in these times. It wouldn't be the
Right.
him from so so yes, so maybe he would say the same kind of things that I am, and where I think I channel him. So it isn't like to look for ways of blaming or shaming or slicing and dicing the human family. It's from the perspective of how do we tell the story differently? How do we tell the story in a compelling way? That we can see a compelling future, that we're drawn towards what we imagine as possibilities for who we really have the potential to be. If we live in a world where are all encouraged to be our best and to do our best. So I suspect that he would react, he would feel disappointment, discouragement, questions about what this is still something that's going on. Um, and yet I think that he would have that. So, what would be even more powerful than that would be his sense of hope and his sense of responsibility. So, yeah, that's what I suspect. I don't. I don't think. I don't think it would break anything, in his character or demeanor.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that resonated with me when I first interviewed you, John, and it's in Ray of Light chapter about Gideon, is you talked about how we tend to focus on just a few individuals, a Jackie Robinson, a
Yes.
Muhammad Ali, a Martin Luther King, but
Yes.
there were a lot of foot soldiers before then,
Yes.
and Gideon Smith was one of them.
Yes.
Um, and I just recently read a book by David Halberstam, The Children.
Mhm.
And again, like I said, Martin Luther King, deservedly so, is at the top of the civil rights movement. But there were so many brave people that came out of Nashville: Diane Nash, John Lewis, who started the freedom rides. Martin Luther King later said that they helped set the stage for him. Um, so that's an additional point of pride for you, is that Gideon was in his own way a Jackie Robinson, correct?
Yes, yes, yes. And as you're also noting, so there's so many unsung heroes
Yeah.
or heroines. Um, and so what that makes me feel, and again, it comes back to the idea of what we envision, what we imagine. So, how do we tell the stories differently? Lots of times, if we focus on the few, the few that exemplify something, but if they become elevated to hero status, it can take a sense of responsibility from all of us. It can put us in a place of waiting for the next one to come along and do huge things instead of feeling responsibility for our day-to-day actions, for those. um, it became a mantra for me to do small things, you know,
Yeah.
to do those small things, but guided by a very clear and powerful and strong and enduring vision. So it puts, the small things, in another context. So that's, I think about that and wonder about that. How do we tell the story differently so that there are ways to acknowledge? So, we don't need to track down and name every single person that contributed, because that it can't happen that way. Um, but we can acknowledge, I think, and value and underscore the principles underneath that. So how do we memorialize um, pioneer spirit? How do we memorialize um, the undeterrability? How do we memorialize, those kinds of commitments that, our heroes exemplified? And counter to that, how do we look at, like, the behaviors that have been harmful and that have held us back, instead of saying, okay, it was a Hitler. It was, I mean, name your villain. It was this, because that also absolves us of shared responsibility. What was it that led to folks of that sort uh, becoming empowered and emboldened? So, how do we address, what's underneath all of that? And so I think that's also, part of that idea of telling the stories differently.
Well, as you look at the landscape of college athletics now, John, and I assume you generally follow college athletics with
Generally. I'm going to confess, I'm not someone that, like, follows, the rankings and so on.
however, I'm certain you're aware of all the issues around NIL, name, image, and likeness that's coming up. And as you look at the
Yeah.
rosters of particularly, I'm going to say championship teams or all teams,
Yes.
there's a disproportionate number of minority, specifically Black athletes on these teams.
Yes.
And as if we have any of them listening now,
Yes.
and based on your grandfather's experience, where he used athletics as a means to an end,
Right.
get a great education, and also be a trailblazer,
Yes.
what would be your message to these young athletes out there now who have this, 15 seconds of fame?
Yes.
And we know everyone, I probably had those dreams when I was in high school. I was a pretty good athlete. You think you're going to the pros,
Mhm.
but the statistics are not generally on your side. What message would you have to those young men and women?
I would have to think about that. Yeah.
Well,
I'm going,
John,
yes.
you've talked to schools about it. You've returned to your school to talk about it to classmates. You talk about what you've told them.
Um, so I so I was just thinking of something more specific to, if you pursue like that path in sports. So, maybe the one thing that I would do that or put out there. So I'm a person, I have more in my conversations, and at least what I hope, that I communicate more question marks than exclamation points. So my questions that I would put out there, instead of a prescription, is like, so, what do you see as your role, as your responsibility? What is your vision? What is your dream? Um, and like, what does that dream look like bigger? So, maybe the dream is, all right, I want to play for the NFL. I want to, make X, number of dollars a year. So I would just come back, okay, so what does that dream look like, bigger? What does that look like? What does that dream look like for your family? What does that dream look like for your community? What does that dream look like for the world? So it would just, yeah, it would be more along those lines instead
Yeah.
of, having advice.
Right.
Yeah.
And I should have mentioned earlier that John was a teacher in the Boston area for a long time. He's retired now. But getting back to what you talked about, foot soldiers, John, and how it resonated with me, I think that ultimately led to my new book, which is now out and available for purchase. The Right Thing to Do, the true pioneers of the 1960s college football integration.
Yeah.
And I bring up all these foot soldiers
Yes.
that
Yes.
play the big role that cleared the way. Duffy Daugherty's 1960 teams were college football's first fully integrated rosters.
Yes. Yes.
And they had success so that other schools in the North and the West and the East that had been living by the unwritten rule of only a half dozen black players, they began to follow Duffy's model. The Southern schools began to recruit their first black player. People like Jerry Levias at SMU, Warren McVeigh at Houston, the Kentucky players with Wilbur Hackett and Lester McLean at Tennessee. All those people, James Owen at Auburn, in-state Alabama's in-state rival, they had a black player before Bear Bryant. All those people cleared the road so that the 1970 USC Alabama game could be played without incident. The
Yes.
unfortunate thing is, though, because of an American history, we like to have one figure to focus our story on. Somehow, a myth through poor sports writing got regurgitated that Bear Bryant waved his wand one night in 1970 and Sam Cunningham ran over Alabama's all-white football team. And that was the end of desegregation and racism in Alabama. Well, that's
Right.
not what happened. It was all the foot soldiers beforehand.
Yes.
And that's why they're so important.
Yes. Yes.
Well, let's wrap this up. A couple of things I want to bring up. Herman, you're going to be delivering your own Hall of Fame speech in about 6 weeks or so. Tell John about that. John, do you have any tips for Herman on what the
Well,
points to make?
let me hear some more details. So what is this Hall of Fame honor?
Well, John, I'm from Alabama, as
Yeah.
we mentioned earlier, and this year I was selected and will be inducted in November 9th into the Alabama Business Hall of Fame. So I'm touched by it. Just wish that my mom and my wife, Iris, of 42 years, could. I know they'll be there with me emotionally. However, I'll have.
Yes.
I've got 2.5, 3 tables of family members, brothers and sisters, and cousins and business colleagues that'll be there. But it's coming from Alabama, it's quite a quite an honor, and I'm humbled by it.
Yes.
And looking forward again. And my sons and my grandkids will be there. And in terms of setting a foundation of how to behave in the face of adversity, as your grandfather did,
Yes. Yes.
will go out and make things happen. I think that's important. So that's basically my message.
Yeah.
And
Beautiful.
John,
But I'm open to any other suggestions you might have, since you're very experienced on this trail of going and accepting awards.
Yeah. No
and,
suggestions. Yeah. Yeah.
and
You know,
John,
yeah. Go forth with what you are moving with, and just recognize that you are surrounded by all of this love, and
and,
that's what you're channeling.
and John, what he didn't say is he's only the fourth Black person to be inducted. Is that correct, Herman?
Yes.
And one of them is Booker T. Washington, which
Yes.
takes us all the way back to
Right.
Gideon Smith and Ferris State
Yes.
at Hampton University. So yeah, that'll be a great event for you, Herman. The other thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap up here, John, is in addition to your career as a teacher, you are a drummer.
Yes.
So you need to come up with some kind of drum tune to celebrate Gideon.
Uh-huh. Um, so actually, some years back, I started working on a piece called Chummy. So I did have a piano sketch of that. So recent events just triggered me. I have intentions of orchestrating that. So that's in the works. And you had in the outline, you had spoken in terms of, so what would be like a kind of rhythm to end on, or as a way of conveying a message. And so what came to mind for me, it wasn't a specific rhythm, but it brought to mind an experience that I had when I was working with a group of young people. And I used to do an activity called Sound Story. And I would bring a bunch of my percussion instruments, and I would make a sound with one instrument or another, and playing with the idea. So we've heard the expression, picture is worth a thousand words. So I use the expression, a sound is worth 1,000 pictures. So I would play an instrument sound and say, okay, what comes to mind for you? And people would name something, and then I'd keep track of that and use that to feed into a story that I would tell, kind of off the top of my head. And when I would mention that idea that was based on the sound, they would play the instrument. So I that particular day, I had a little triangle, and I struck the triangle, ding, and the young man said, love. And so usually I go with what the participants say, without bringing my own opinion into it. But on that occasion, I just felt moved to say, okay, wait a minute, let's think about that. Because what came to mind, I thought about the film scores and the music that's played when the dangerous force, when the evil force, you hear this music. And you're going, oh wow, it's like so scary and so powerful. And then when love enters the picture, it's like it's like, wait a minute, evil is gonna kick poor love. Love doesn't stand a chance. So I said, okay, well, let's think about this as love. And so I don't have my drum here, but what I did, I took my drum and played. Tried to be like thunder. I said, how about that for the love? So that's my rhythm.
Well, let me say one thing before you closes out, Tom. And it's so interesting. The drums is the instrument that in 6th grade, my mom, who was a laborer, went out and bought me drums. And however, I got involved in athletics and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
only took one drum lesson.
Yes, yes.
And if I had any regret that I look back on that I want to tell you, even though you didn't pursue the sports, and that's what I pursued,
Right, right.
you still have something from a lifetime skill that you can still enjoy. And if I had it to do over again, either the drums or the guitar would have been something that I would have stuck with.
It's not too late.
So,
It's not too late. It's not too
you know,
late.
you may be right. You
Get
may
that, yeah, get that drum out. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, John, this was just such a treat for me. And Tom, I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be a part of live history. This is like an oral history for me to learn and get exposed to so many other things. So, John, wishing you continued success. Congratulations to you and your family for what your grandfather did, because as I always say, we all stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll sign off here, but on our most recent episode of episode 15, we had Ernest Green of the Little Rock Nine, who's a Michigan
Yeah.
State grad, and his college roommate, a white person.
Yeah.
And he signed off by saying, Ernest, John Hanna, Michigan State's president, who
Yes.
led Michigan State's integration role, would be so proud of you. And so I want to say that to you, John, that Gideon Smith would be so proud of you, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my pleasure, and continued success to each of you, and keep up the great work. Yeah, and it was a pleasure, having a chance to see you face to face, Tom, and a pleasure and honor, and as well, a chance to see and interact with you, Herman.